The heat pressed down like a wet blanket on the morning of July 23, 1943. Private First Class Howard Jenkins crouched in the mud at the edge of a coconut grove on New Georgia Island, his hands working methodically through vines and scrap metal scattered across the jungle floor. The sounds of the Solomon Islands surrounded him, insects screaming in the canopy, the distant rumble of artillery from Munda Point, and somewhere close, the rhythmic hacking of machetes against undergrowth. Jenkins wasn't building a fortification in any conventional sense. He was constructing something his squad leader had called backwoods crazy when he'd first proposed it 3 hours earlier. But Jenkins had grown up setting snares for rabbits in the Ozark Hills of Arkansas, and he understood something about terrain, patience, and the predictable paths creatures take when they're hunting. The question hanging over the American advance through New Georgia wasn't whether the Japanese would counterattack. It was when and how many would die before the inevitable happened. What nobody yet understood was that a farm boy's knowledge of animal behavior and his willingness to see enemy soldiers as predictable as deer moving through a hollow would transform a vulnerable supply trail into a killing ground that would claim 60 lives in less than 2 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Solomon Islands campaign of 1943 represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's character. After the strategic victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, American forces began the grinding work of island hopping northward toward the Japanese home islands. New Georgia, part of the Central Solomons, held strategic value primarily because of its airfield at Munda Point. Control of Munda would extend American air cover and bring Japanese positions in the northern Solomons under regular bombardment. The 43rd Infantry Division, reinforced by Marine Raider battalions and elements of the 37th Infantry Division, landed on New Georgia on June 30, 1943, expecting a 2-week operation to secure the airfield. They were still fighting 5 weeks later. The problem wasn't Japanese numbers. American intelligence estimated roughly 5,000 defenders on the island. The problem was terrain and doctrine. New Georgia's interior was a nightmare of coral ridges, mangrove swamps, and triple canopy jungle so dense that units lost contact within 50 yards of each other. The Japanese had constructed an intricate network of defensive positions using the natural terrain, with bunkers built into coral outcroppings and camouflaged so effectively that American patrols often walked within feet of enemy positions without detecting them. More significantly, the Japanese had refined their counterattack doctrine to exploit American weaknesses in jungle warfare. American infantry training in 1943 emphasized firepower and mobility in open terrain. The Standard Rifle Company was organized around the assumption that machine guns and mortars could establish fields of fire, that artillery could be called in to suppress enemy positions, and that infantry squads could maneuver with mutual support. None of these assumptions held in the New Georgia jungle. Artillery observers couldn't see targets through the canopy. Machine guns couldn't establish effective fields of fire when visibility was measured in yards. Radio communication was unreliable in the dense vegetation. The doctrine that worked in North Africa and would later work in Europe was nearly useless in the Pacific jungle. The Japanese understood this. Their counterattack doctrine, refined through years of combat in China and perfected during the Guadalcanal campaign, emphasized night infiltration, close combat with grenades and bayonets, and psychological tactics designed to break American unit cohesion. Japanese commanders had observed that American units, when surprised at night and unable to employ their superior firepower, often broke and retreated in disorder. The standard Japanese tactic involved infiltrating between American positions after dark, attacking supply lines and command posts, and creating chaos in the rear areas while simultaneously launching frontal assaults against defensive positions. By mid-July 1943, this tactical pattern had repeated itself across New Georgia with bloody consistency. American companies would advance during the day, establish perimeter defenses at nightfall, and then endure infiltration attacks that killed sentries, destroyed supplies, and forced units to withdraw at dawn to reorganize. The psychological cost was severe. Infantry units were losing men not to artillery barrages or massed charges they could see and engage, but to invisible enemies who struck from the darkness and disappeared into the jungle before dawn. The fear of nighttime infiltration was eroding combat effectiveness faster than actual casualties. Howard Jenkins had arrived in New Georgia on July 15th as a replacement in Company G, 2nd Battalion, 145th Infantry Regiment. At 21 years old, he represented a specific type of American soldier that would prove unexpectedly valuable in the Pacific, men from rural backgrounds who had grown up hunting, trapping, and navigating wilderness terrain. Jenkins had been raised on a hardscrabble farm in Newton County, Arkansas, where his family supplemented their subsistence farming with hunting and trapping. He set his first rabbit snare at age 8, learned to read animal trails by age 10, and by his teenage years was bringing in significant income during trapping season by harvesting furs from raccoons, foxes, and the occasional bobcat. This background meant nothing to the Army when Jenkins was drafted in February 1942. He went through basic training at Camp Walters in Texas, learned standard infantry skills, and was shipped to the Pacific as anonymous replacement personnel. His service record listed him as a rifleman, qualified marksman, no special skills noted. But Jenkins carried knowledge that the Army's training infrastructure couldn't replicate an intuitive understanding of how animals move through terrain, how to identify travel routes, and how to construct traps that exploited instinctive behavior patterns. When Company G established a defensive position along a supply trail 3 miles south of Munda Point on July 22nd, Jenkins recognized something the Army-trained officers and NCOs didn't see. The trail wasn't just a path through the jungle, it was a game trail, a natural corridor created by the island's wild pigs, moving between water sources and feeding grounds. The Japanese were using it exactly as animals would because it was the path of least resistance through otherwise impenetrable vegetation, because it provided solid footing in a landscape of mud and roots, and because humans, like animals, instinctively follow established paths when moving through unfamiliar terrain at night. The company commander, Captain Robert Morrison, had positioned his 3 rifle platoons in a standard defensive perimeter around a small clearing where the supply trail widened. Mortars were set up in the center, machine guns covered the obvious approaches, and fighting positions were dug in along the perimeter with interlocking fields of fire. It was textbook infantry defense, exactly what Morrison had learned at Fort Benning. It was also exactly what the Japanese expected, and it had the same vulnerabilities that had gotten other companies mauled in previous weeks. The perimeter could be infiltrated between positions. The limited visibility at night made it impossible to engage attackers until they were dangerously close. And once the Japanese got inside the perimeter, the Americans' superior firepower became a liability because they risked shooting each other in the darkness. Jenkins approached his squad leader, Sergeant William Dutch, just before dusk on July 22nd, with a proposal that Dutch initially dismissed as backwoods crazy. Jenkins wanted to construct a trap system along the trail approaches to the perimeter, using techniques adapted from his rabbit snares. Not to catch soldiers, that was impossible, but to channel them, slow them, and most importantly, make them predictable. Dutch was a career soldier from Philadelphia who thought hunting was something you did with shotguns and bird dogs, not traps and snares. He told Jenkins to focus on improving his fighting position. Jenkins went to Captain Morrison directly, which was a breach of protocol that should have earned him a reprimand. Instead, Morrison listened. The captain was a 32-year-old National Guard officer from Iowa who had commanded Company G since its activation in 1941. He'd lost 17 men in the past week to infiltration attacks and understood that his, by-the-book, defensive tactics weren't working. When Jenkins explained his concept not in terms of trapping theory, but in simple practical terms about channeling movement and creating predictable kill zones, Morrison made a decision that probably saved his command. He gave Jenkins 12 men and 4 hours to build whatever he wanted, with the understanding that if it didn't work, Jenkins would spend the rest of the war filling sandbags. What Jenkins constructed along the 2 main trail approaches to Company G's perimeter wasn't sophisticated by engineering standards, but it demonstrated a profound understanding of human behavior under stress. He started by identifying the natural choke points where the trails narrowed between large trees or coral outcroppings, places where moving soldiers would bunch up, naturally. At each choke point, he constructed tripwires using salvaged telephone wire, strung 6 inches off the ground, and designed not to trigger explosives but to create noise. The wires were connected to empty ration cans, filled with pebbles and suspended from branches. 30 yards before each tripwire, he created what he called false trails, small gaps in the undergrowth that looked like easier paths, but were actually dead ends that looped back toward the main trail. These weren't meant to fool soldiers in daylight, but in darkness, they would tempt infiltrators looking for quiet approaches around obvious defensive positions. The false trails were marked with barely visible white rags that would catch moonlight enough to suggest a path, but not obvious enough to seem like a trap. Between the false trails and the tripwires, Jenkins placed what he called stop points, places where approaching soldiers would instinctively pause. He created these by partially blocking the point's trail with fallen logs positioned at angles that required soldiers to step over them carefully. The logs weren't obstacles, they could be crossed easily, but they forced anyone moving in the dark to slow down and watch their footing. More importantly, they created predictable locations where soldiers would cluster as they waited for the men ahead to navigate the obstacle. At each stop point, Jenkins had his work party mark specific trees with small notches at chest height, visible only from the American defensive positions. These notches marked exact firing lanes that machine gunners and riflemen had already registered during daylight. When Morrison first saw the setup, he understood immediately. Jenkins had created a system that would channel infiltrators into specific locations, slow them down at those locations, and provide advance warning of their approach while marking their exact positions for American gunners who would be firing in darkness. And most crucial, Jenkins had his team clear narrow sight lines from the defensive positions to each stop point, cutting away undergrowth, but leaving the overhead canopy intact. These weren't obvious gaps that would alert approaching soldiers, but they provided just enough clearance that muzzle flashes from the American positions wouldn't be immediately blocked by vegetation. In jungle fighting, muzzle flash often revealed American positions before bullets hit their targets, leading to immediate return fire. Jenkins's cleared lanes meant American gunners could fire multiple bursts from each position before needing to displace. Captain Morrison positioned his 2 heavy machine guns to cover the stop points Jenkins had marked, with specific instructions to the gunners to aim at the marked trees and fire in 3 to 5 round bursts when they heard the noise triggers. He placed his best riflemen in positions with clear sight lines to the false trails, with orders to wait for muzzle flashes from the machine guns before engaging. The rest of the company maintained standard perimeter defense, ready to respond to attacks from other directions. The Japanese came at 02:30 hours on July 23rd. Intelligence would later establish that the attacking force was a reinforced platoon from the Japanese 229th Infantry Regiment, approximately 75 men, led by Lieutenant Nakamura Yoshio. They were experienced jungle fighters, veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign, and they were following standard infiltration doctrine: approach the American perimeter in darkness, infiltrate between defensive positions, and create chaos before the Americans could organize an effective response. They had successfully used these tactics against American positions twice in the previous week, inflicting casualties and forcing withdrawals. They moved down the supply trail in 2 columns, maintaining noise discipline, with scouts ahead to detect obstacles, tripwires. The scouts found Jenkins's first tripwire, marked it, and the column bypassed it exactly as trained. This was predictable. Experienced infiltrators expected defensive tripwires and knew how to avoid them. What they didn't expect was that the tripwire was the warning system, not the trap. When the scouts bypassed the tripwire and moved down what appeared to be a clearer path, Jenkins's false trail, the column naturally followed. The false trail curved through the jungle for 40 yards before looping back toward the main trail, exactly where Jenkins had positioned his first stop point. The Japanese column, realizing they'd been led astray, regrouped on the main trail, bunching up at the stop point while scouts moved forward to reorient. Private Raymond Lucas, a machine gunner from Company G's weapons platoon, heard the noise first, the soft rattle of equipment, and whispered voices in Japanese. He couldn't see the soldiers, but he could see the marked tree Jenkins had notched, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky above the jungle canopy. Lucas aimed 6 inches to the left of the notch, exactly as Jenkins had instructed during the afternoon rehearsal, and pressed his trigger. The M1917 Browning machine gun fired at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. Lucas fired a 4-second burst, 30 rounds, then shifted his aim 2 feet right and fired again. In the darkness, he couldn't see what he was hitting, but he could hear the results: screams, bodies hitting the ground, and the distinctive sound of equipment being dropped as men dove for cover. The Japanese responded exactly as their doctrine prescribed. Soldiers who survived the initial burst dropped prone and began returning fire at Lucas's muzzle flash. Others attempted to flank the machine gun position by moving into the jungle on either side of the trail. This was the tactical response that had worked on Guadalcanal, and it should have worked here, but Jenkins had anticipated it. The soldiers who moved into the jungle looking for flanking routes found themselves in more false trails, narrow gaps in the undergrowth that seemed like good approaches but dead-ended after 20 or 30 yards. As they backtracked toward the main trail, they triggered Jenkins' secondary noise traps: more cans, more wire, more rattling that gave away their positions. American riflemen, waiting in positions Jenkins had selected to cover the false trails, engaged targets they could identify only by sound and by the occasional muzzle flash from Japanese return fire. The second Japanese column, approaching on a parallel trail 200 yards to the south, heard the firing and accelerated their advance, hoping to hit the American perimeter while Company G was focused on the first attack. They ran directly into Jenkins's second trap system, identical to the first. The same trip wires, the same false trails, the same stop points with marked trees. The second machine gun, manned by Private First Class Thomas Kern, opened fire at 02:38, 8 minutes after the first engagement began. What happened over the next 90 minutes wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a disintegration of Japanese tactical cohesion under conditions where their infiltration doctrine became a liability. The Japanese platoon was trained to move quickly through jungle terrain, to infiltrate American positions, and to create chaos through aggressive close combat. But Jenkins's trap system had broken their formation into small groups, scattered across 200 yards of jungle, disoriented by false trails, channeled into predetermined kill zones, and unable to mass their forces for an effective assault. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese soldiers who attempted to reorganize and press the attack found themselves moving down trails that led back to the same stop points, where American machine gunners had already registered their aim. Soldiers who attempted to bypass the trails and move through the jungle itself found the undergrowth impenetrable in darkness. The same dense vegetation that made New Georgia such difficult terrain also made it impossible to move quickly, off established paths. They were forced back onto the trails, where Jenkins's system channeled them into American firing lanes. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive action and night-fighting superiority. But in this engagement, the Americans held every advantage. They were fighting from prepared positions, firing into predetermined kill zones, using noise discipline, while the Japanese movement through the trap system created constant sound cues. More critically, the Japanese couldn't see their enemy or understand the terrain they were fighting in, while the Americans, guided by Jenkins's marked trees and prepared lanes, knew exactly where to aim. Captain Morrison, monitoring the battle from his command post, made a crucial decision at 0300 hours. Instead of ordering his perimeter defense to advance and engage the disrupted Japanese forces, he kept his men in position and let the trap system work. This violated standard army doctrine, which emphasized aggressive counterattack and maintaining initiative. But Morrison understood that in jungle fighting at night, American advantages in firepower and organization only worked from prepared positions. Leaving those positions to chase scattered enemy soldiers in the darkness would surrender the advantages Jenkins's system had created. The Japanese made 3 organized attempts to break through to the American perimeter. Each attempt followed the same pattern. Soldiers would gather in the darkness, organize an assault formation, and charge down the trail toward what they believed was the American defensive line. Each time, they ran into stop points, where tripwires and obstacles forced them to slow down and bunch up. Each time, American machine guns and rifles engaged from positions the Japanese couldn't pinpoint in the darkness. And each time, the assault broke apart short of the American positions, with surviving soldiers retreating into the jungle or going to ground along the trails. By 400 hours, the firing had decreased to sporadic exchanges, individual Japanese soldiers taking shots at suspected American positions, American riflemen responding to movement or sound. Morrison ordered his men to hold fire unless they had clear targets, conserving ammunition and avoiding revealing positions unnecessarily. The jungle settled into an eerie quiet, broken by the moans of wounded soldiers and the sounds of men moving cautiously through the undergrowth. Dawn came at 05:45 on July 23rd, revealing the full scope of what Jenkins's improvised system had accomplished. When Morrison sent patrols forward to secure the trails and count casualties, they found 57 Japanese dead scattered across the 2 approach routes, concentrated at the stop points where machine gun fire had caught them bunched up and exposed. Another 11 wounded soldiers were captured, too badly injured to retreat with the remnants of their unit. The total 68 casualties from a force estimated at 75 men represented a catastrophic loss for the Japanese platoon. Company G had suffered 4 wounded, none seriously, and had expended approximately 3,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, less than a single day's allocation for a company in sustained combat. The disparity was so extreme that when Morrison filed his after-action report, the battalion commander initially suspected the casualty count was inflated. It wasn't until Graves' registration teams confirmed the body count and intelligence officers interrogated the captured wounded that the numbers were accepted as accurate. The captured Japanese soldiers, when questioned through translators, described an attack that had felt like walking into an ambush that kept repeating itself. They had expected to find American defensive positions they could infiltrate or overwhelm. Instead, they found themselves lost in a maze of trails that seemed to lead nowhere, unable to close with an enemy who appeared to know their exact location at all times. Several prisoners described the psychological impact of the noise traps, the constant rattling that announced their movements and made stealth impossible. One captured sergeant compared it to fighting ghosts who could see in the dark while the Japanese stumbled blind. The immediate tactical impact of Jenkins's defensive success rippled through the 43rd Infantry Division within 48 hours. Captain Morrison's after-action report, initially filed as a routine combat summary, attracted attention at battalion headquarters precisely because the casualty ratio was so unusual. In the New Georgia campaign through late July 1943, American units were typically suffering casualty ratios of 1-3 or 1-4 against Japanese defenders, meaning for every Japanese soldier killed, American forces lost 3 or 4 men. Morrison's report described a ratio of 17-1 in favor of the Americans, achieved not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through what the report termed improvised channeling defenses based on game trail principles. Colonel William Stebbins, commanding the 145th Infantry Regiment, visited Company G's position on July 24th to personally inspect Jenkins's trap system. Stebbins was a West Point graduate, class of 1923, whose military education had emphasized conventional warfare in European terrain. He had never hunted, never trapped animals, and had a frame of reference for understanding why Jenkins's approach had been so effective. But Stebbins understood the results, and he understood that the standard defensive doctrine his regiment had been employing was getting men killed without proportional Japanese casualties. What Stebbins found when he walked the trails with Jenkins wasn't a revolutionary military innovation. It was a fundamental insight about human behavior that military doctrine had overlooked. Jenkins explained his thinking in simple terms that Stebbins later incorporated into regimental training guidance. Soldiers moving through the jungle at night, Jenkins argued, behaved remarkably like animals moving through unfamiliar territory. They followed established paths because creating new routes through dense vegetation made noise and required time. They paused at obstacles to assess crossing points. They gravitated toward gaps in vegetation that suggested easier movement. And most critically, they made predictable decisions when faced with limited options in darkness. Military training in 1943 taught soldiers to think tactically, to assess enemy positions, identify cover and concealment, and maneuver to create tactical advantages. But this training assumed reasonable visibility and some understanding of terrain. In jungle darkness, those assumptions collapsed. Soldiers couldn't assess what they couldn't see, and terrain that was barely visible in moonlight looked fundamentally different than it had appeared during daylight reconnaissance. Jenkins's insight was that under these conditions, training became secondary to instinct, and instinct was predictable. The false trails were the clearest example. In daylight, any experienced soldier would recognize them as dead ends or suspicious diversions. But in darkness, moving with noise, discipline, and focused on avoiding detection, soldiers saw what appeared to be a clearer path and took it without extensive analysis. The decision made, since in the moment a path with fewer obstacles meant quieter movement and faster progress. It was only after following the false trail for 30 or 40 yards that soldiers realized they'd been diverted, and by then they were bunched up, disoriented, and positioned exactly where Jenkins had anticipated they would be. The stop points exploited a different aspect of human behavior, the instinctive caution people exercise when navigating obstacles in limited visibility. A log lying across a trail isn't a significant obstacle in daylight, but in darkness, it requires attention. Soldiers leading a column will pause to determine the safest way across. Soldiers following will bunch up behind the leaders while waiting their turn. The pause might last only 15 or 20 seconds, but that was enough time for machine gunners who knew exactly where to aim to deliver devastating fire into a concentrated target. Colonel Stebbins recognized that Jenkins's system worked because it was based on observation of behavior rather than assumptions about tactical training. Japanese infiltrators were highly trained, experienced soldiers who had successfully executed night attacks against American positions throughout the Pacific Campaign. But their training didn't eliminate their human instincts, and their experience actually made them more predictable because they had learned to trust their tactical judgment. When that judgment was based on incomplete information trails that seemed to offer good routes, obstacles that appeared to be natural terrain features, even elite soldiers made exploitable mistakes. Stebbins ordered Jenkins to brief the regimental staff on his methods on July 26. The briefing took place at the regimental command post, a cluster of tents in a coconut grove 4 miles south of Munda Point. Jenkins, still a private first class who had been in combat for less than 2 weeks, stood before a group of officers and senior NCOs and explained rabbit, snaring techniques to men who had spent years studying military tactics. The incongruity wasn't lost on anyone present, but the casualty figures from Company G's engagement commanded respect. Jenkins described his approach in practical terms. Start by identifying natural corridors, where enemy soldiers will move because the alternatives are impassable. Mark those corridors in daylight, and understand their features where they narrow, where obstacles force movement into predictable patterns, where sightlines exist from defensive positions. Create diversions that look attractive in limited visibility but lead nowhere. Position noise triggers not as obstacles but as warning systems that announce enemy movement while simultaneously disorienting the attackers. And most critically, defend from positions that cover predictable locations rather than trying to defend every possible approach. The regimental intelligence officer, Captain James Holbrook, asked the obvious question: would this work once the Japanese understood the system? Jenkins' answer revealed a sophisticated understanding of tactical adaptation. The system worked, he argued, because it exploited terrain and human behavior, not Japanese ignorance. Even if Japanese commanders knew that American units were using false trails and channeling tactics, individual soldiers moving through jungle darkness would still face the same choices: follow established paths or try to forge new routes through impenetrable vegetation, trust their judgment about which routes looked passable, or spend time in dangerous reconnaissance, move quickly and accept the risk of obstacles, or move slowly and remain exposed longer. The genius of Jenkins's approach was that it didn't require the enemy to be fooled. It only required them to make rational decisions based on limited information. A false trail that looked passable in darkness was still the rational choice, even if soldiers suspected it might be a diversion, because the alternative was thrashing through undergrowth that would definitely make noise and slow movement. A stop point created by a fallen log was still a place where soldiers would pause, even if they suspected it might be covered by American fire, because rushing past it without checking for other obstacles risked injury or creating noise. Colonel Stebbins authorized Jenkins to train platoon leaders from across the regiment on his methods. Over the next week, Jenkins conducted field demonstrations with 12 different platoons, showing officers and NCOs how to identify natural corridors, construct false trails, position noise triggers, and mark firing lanes. The training wasn't formalized into doctrine. The Army's institutional process for validating and disseminating tactical innovations would take months, and the New Georgia campaign needed solutions immediately. Instead, Stebbins issued it as regimental guidance, essentially telling his subordinate commanders to try Jenkins's methods and report results. The results were mixed, but instructive. Units that implemented the complete system false trails, stop points, noise triggers, and marked firing lanes reported significant success in defending against night infiltration attempts. Units that tried to cherry-pick elements of the system without understanding the underlying principles found it less effective. The key distinction was whether leaders understood they were shaping enemy behavior rather than simply creating obstacles. A tripwire positioned randomly might warn of enemy approach, but it didn't channel attackers into kill zones. A false trail that didn't lead to a prepared firing position was just a diversion without tactical value. By early August 1943, when American forces finally secured Munda Airfield and consolidated control over southern New Georgia, the regimental after-action analysis showed measurable changes in defensive engagement outcomes. Units employing Jenkins style, channeling defenses, reported casualty ratios averaging 8-1 in their favor during night engagements, compared to the 3-1 ratios typical of conventional perimeter defenses. The difference represented hundreds of American lives saved and, more significantly, a shift in psychological advantage in jungle night fighting. The psychological dimension was perhaps more important than the tactical results. American infantry units throughout the Pacific Campaign struggled with the fear of Japanese night infiltration attacks. The standard defensive response, tight perimeters, aggressive patrolling, and rapid-fire responses to any suspected contact often resulted in American units shooting at shadows, expending ammunition inefficiently, and revealing their positions to actual infiltrators. Jenkins' approach gave defenders confidence because it created a structured response to ambiguous threats. Soldiers manning positions that covered marked firing lanes knew where to aim when they heard noise triggers activate. They weren't shooting at suspected movement in random jungle. They were engaging enemies in predetermined locations. This confidence translated into more effective fire discipline. Company G's engagement on July 23rd had involved approximately 3,000 rounds, fired to achieve 68 enemy casualties, a ratio of roughly 44 rounds per casualty. Typical jungle engagements saw ratios of 200 to 300 rounds per casualty, reflecting the difficulty of engaging targets in limited visibility. The difference wasn't that Company G's soldiers were better marksmen, it was that they were shooting at targets they could anticipate, rather than targets they had to find. Japanese tactical doctrine began adapting to American channeling defenses by mid-August, but the adaptations revealed the fundamental dilemma Jenkins's approach created. Japanese commanders instructed infiltration units to avoid established trails entirely, and to cut new routes through the jungle, using machetes and hand tools. This solution eliminated the channeling effect, but created new problems. Cutting trails through dense jungle took time and made noise, eliminating the speed and stealth advantages that made infiltration tactics effective. Units that tried this approach often found themselves still in American defensive zones when dawn came, exposed to daylight counterattacks with supporting artillery. Alternative Japanese tactics involved sending smaller infiltration teams, 4 or 5 men instead of platoon-strength units, who could move more quietly and slip through gaps in American defenses. This approach was more successful in avoiding channeling traps, but it surrendered the mass necessary to overwhelm defensive positions once inside American lines. Small teams might kill sentries or destroy supplies, but they couldn't create the chaos that larger infiltration units achieved. The tactical calculus had shifted. Japanese commanders had to choose between infiltration tactics that risked devastating casualties or more cautious approaches that sacrificed offensive potential. Howard Jenkins himself became a minor legend within the 43rd Infantry Division, though his fame was short-lived and largely confined to soldiers who had served in New Georgia. He was promoted to corporal on August 2, 1943, and assigned to the regimental staff as an informal advisor on defensive tactics. He spent 3 weeks working with different companies, helping them implement channeling defenses before the division moved to new operations. His knowledge was valued, but he remained fundamentally an enlisted man with specialized practical skills rather than a professional soldier with career prospects in the military establishment. The institutional army struggled to integrate Jenkins's innovations into formal doctrine. The problem wasn't recognition of effectiveness, the statistical results were undeniable. The problem was systematization. The Army's training and doctrine infrastructure was designed to create standardized, repeatable tactics that could be taught to hundreds of thousands of soldiers with varying backgrounds and aptitudes. Jenkins's approach required something the Army couldn't easily teach: an intuitive understanding of terrain, animal behavior, and human psychology developed through years of personal experience in rural environments. A training manual on channeling defenses would have read something like, "Identify natural movement corridors in jungle terrain by observing wildlife trails and vegetation patterns. Create diversionary routes that exploit human tendency to choose apparently easier paths when moving in limited visibility. Position obstacles at locations where tactical considerations will cause enemy forces to pause and consolidate." The instructions were technically accurate, but practically useless to an officer from Brooklyn who had never seen a Tansaveria, game trail, or set an animal snare. The knowledge Jenkins possessed was tacit, learned through doing, rather than through abstract instruction, and tacit knowledge resisted the systematization that military doctrine required. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The broader significance of Jenkins's improvised defenses lay not in their tactical innovation, but in what they revealed about the gap between institutional military knowledge and practical battlefield effectiveness. The United States Army of 1943 was the most technologically advanced military force in history, supported by unprecedented industrial capacity, sophisticated logistics, and comprehensive training systems. But fighting effectively in Pacific jungle terrain required knowledge that couldn't be manufactured in training camps or derived from military theory. It required understanding vegetation patterns, animal behavior, human instinct under stress, and the specific characteristics of terrain that looked fundamentally different at night than in daylight. This knowledge existed among American soldiers, but it was distributed unevenly and often unrecognized by the institutional military. Farm boys from rural Arkansas understood terrain and animal behavior. Hunters from Michigan and Wisconsin understood how to read trails and anticipate movement patterns. Trappers from Montana understood how to create diversions and channeling systems. But the Army's personnel system classified all of them identically as riflemen, basic infantry, no special skills. Their knowledge was invisible to the institution until someone like Jenkins happened to be in the right place with the right audience, facing the right problem. The Pacific War would see numerous similar instances where practical knowledge from civilian life proved more valuable than formal military training. Navajo Code, talkers brought linguistic skills that created unbreakable battlefield communications. Construction workers from the American Southwest brought experience with heavy equipment and desert conditions that proved essential in North African operations. Commercial fishermen brought knowledge of tides, currents, and coastal navigation that informed amphibious operations. In each case, the Army initially failed to recognize or systematically exploit these skills until battlefield necessity forced innovation. Jenkins's contribution to the New Georgia campaign was ultimately preserved not in formal doctrine, but in informal knowledge. Transmission experienced soldiers telling new arrivals about the techniques that had worked, units adapting methods based on what they heard had been successful elsewhere. By late 1943, defensive channeling tactics were being employed throughout the Pacific Theater, though they were rarely credited to Jenkins and were often modified beyond recognition from his original approach. The essential insight remained. In jungle warfare, understanding terrain and human behavior was often more valuable than firepower and training. The immediate aftermath of the July 23 engagement saw Howard Jenkins briefly elevated from anonymous replacement to regimental asset, but his influence proved fleeting in ways that illuminate the gap between battlefield innovation and institutional recognition. After his promotion to corporal and 3 weeks as an informal tactical advisor, Jenkins returned to Company G in late August when the 43rd Infantry Division began preparing for operations in the Northern Solomons. The regimental commander, Colonel Stebbins, had written a commendation citing Jenkins's innovative defensive tactics that resulted in extraordinary casualty ratios and demonstrated exceptional tactical thinking. The commendation was filed with the division headquarters and promptly disappeared into the administrative bureaucracy of a military organization processing millions of personnel actions across global theaters of war. Jenkins would spend the remainder of the Pacific War as a squad leader in Company G, participating in operations across the Solomon Islands and later in the Philippines campaign. He was wounded twice superficially by shrapnel on Luzon in January 1945, and more seriously by rifle fire during the Manila operation in February. He received a Purple Heart for each wound, a Bronze Star for actions unrelated to the New Georgia engagement, and was discharged as a staff sergeant in December 1945. His service record made no mention of the defensive system that had killed 60 Japanese soldiers in 2 hours and influenced defensive tactics across an entire theater of operations. The institutional Army's response to Jenkins's innovations followed a pattern typical of bottom-up tactical adaptation in military organizations. The ideas were rapidly disseminated through informal channels, soldiers talking to soldiers, officers sharing lessons learned, units adapting techniques that seemed effective. But formal recognition and systematization moved at the glacial pace of bureaucratic process. A report on defensive tactics in jungle terrain was compiled by the 43rd Infantry Division's Intelligence Section in September 1943, incorporating lessons from New Georgia, including Jenkins's channeling methods. The report was forwarded to higher headquarters, where it joined thousands of similar after-action analyses, competing for attention from staff officers focused on strategic planning rather than tactical refinement. By the time Army training doctrine formally incorporated elements of channeling defense into jungle warfare instruction in mid-1944, the specific connection to Jenkins had been lost. The techniques were attributed generally to lessons learned from South Pacific operations, with no individual credited. This wasn't malice or deliberate erasure, it was how institutional knowledge typically formed in military organizations. Tactical innovations emerged from battlefield necessity, spread through informal networks, and eventually crystallized into doctrine that was presented as if it had always existed. The individuals who originated the innovations were rarely part of that final narrative. The Japanese response to American defensive adaptations on New Georgia provides insight into how tactical innovation creates cascading effects that extend beyond immediate battlefield results. By September 1943, Japanese commanders in the Solomon Islands had identified American channeling defenses as a significant threat to their infiltration tactics. Intelligence reports compiled from debriefings with survivors of failed night attacks described American positions that seemed to anticipate Japanese movement, trails that led into killing zones, and defensive fires that caught infiltration units in vulnerable positions repeatedly. Japanese tactical doctrine responded with what military theorists would call a counter-adaptation, modifications to infiltration tactics designed to neutralize American channeling defenses. These modifications included more extensive reconnaissance of approach routes, use of smaller infiltration teams that could bypass established trails, and greater emphasis on diversionary attacks to pull American defenders out of prepared positions. Each modification addressed specific vulnerabilities that channeling defenses had exposed, but each also imposed costs that degraded the overall effectiveness of Japanese infiltration tactics. More extensive reconnaissance meant longer preparation times and greater risk of detection. Smaller infiltration teams meant less combat power available to exploit successful penetrations of American lines. Diversionary attacks consumed personnel and ammunition that might otherwise support main efforts. The cumulative effect was that Japanese night infiltration, which had been a significant tactical advantage in early Pacific campaigns, became progressively less effective as American defensive methods improved. This shift in tactical balance contributed to broader strategic changes in how both sides approached jungle warfare. The statistical record of defensive engagements in the Solomon Islands campaign shows measurable changes that correlate with the adoption of channeling defense tactics. In the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 through February 1943, American defensive positions typically suffered casualty ratios of approximately 1 American killed or wounded for every 2 to 3 Japanese casualties inflicted during night engagements. By the later stages of the New Georgia campaign in August and September 1943, these ratios had shifted to approximately 1 American casualty for every 6 to 8 Japanese casualties. While multiple factors contributed to this shift, improved training, better equipment, growing experience, the tactical adaptation in defensive methods was a significant component. The human cost of these statistical improvements is difficult to calculate precisely, but worth considering. If channeling defense tactics reduced American casualties in night engagements by even 30% across the remainder of the Pacific War, a conservative estimate based on New Georgia data, the total number of American lives saved would number in the thousands. These weren't soldiers who avoided death in dramatic last stands or heroic assaults. They were soldiers who survived unremarkable defensive engagements because their units were using tactics that made Japanese infiltration more costly and less effective. The absence of death is invisible in historical narratives, but it represents Jenkins's most significant contribution to the war effort. The broader implications of Jenkins's improvised defenses extend beyond tactical innovation to questions about expertise, knowledge, and institutional learning in military organizations. The United States military in World War II was an institution undergoing revolutionary expansion, growing from fewer than 200,000 active duty personnel in 1939 to over 12 million by 1945. This expansion required standardization, common training, common doctrine, common equipment to create a coherent fighting force from an extraordinarily diverse population. But standardization inevitably meant that specialized knowledge and skills were overlooked or underutilized. Jenkins represented a type of expertise that the institutional military didn't know how to identify or employ systematically. His knowledge of terrain, reading, animal behavior, and trap construction was as specialized and difficult to acquire as engineering or foreign language skills, but it wasn't recognized as a formal specialty. The Army had programs to identify and train engineers, linguists, and technical specialists. It had no program to identify farm boys who understood how animals moved through terrain because that knowledge was considered merely personal background rather than a military skill. This gap between institutional recognition and practical value appeared throughout the American military experience in World War II. The Manhattan Project recruited physicists and engineers, but initially overlooked the practical machinists and technicians whose skills were essential to actually building atomic weapons. The Army Air Forces developed sophisticated navigation and bombing technology, but found that farm boys who had learned to read landscapes from small aircraft were often better at visual navigation than formally trained navigators using some stickly things, instruments. The Navy's submarine service discovered that commercial fishermen often had better intuitive understanding of ocean currents and underwater terrain than academy-trained officers. In each case, the pattern was similar. Practical knowledge developed through civilian experience proved valuable for military applications, but the institutional military initially failed to recognize or systematically exploit that knowledge. Innovation came from individuals who happened to be in positions where their specialized knowledge became relevant, not from institutional processes designed to identify and deploy expertise effectively. The post-war period saw some effort to capture and systematize lessons learned from tactical innovations like Jenkins's channeling defenses. The Army's Historical Division compiled detailed studies of Pacific campaigns, including analyses of defensive tactics that had proved effective in jungle warfare. These studies informed post-war doctrine development and training programs, contributing to the body of institutional knowledge the military carried into future conflicts. But the connection between specific innovations and the individuals who developed them was usually lost in this process. When the United States military engaged in jungle warfare during the Vietnam conflict in the 1960s and 70s, defensive tactics included elements that directly descended from innovations first employed on New Georgia. The use of mechanical ambushes, explosive devices positioned along known enemy movement routes, was a technological evolution of Jenkins's concept of channeling attackers into predetermined kill zones. The emphasis on controlling key terrain features that limited enemy movement options reflected the same understanding of terrain as a tactical weapon that Jenkins had demonstrated. But nobody in Vietnam knew they were employing tactics first developed by an Arkansas farm boy setting rabbit snares in the Solomon Islands 20 years earlier. Howard Jenkins himself returned to Newton County, Arkansas, after the war, and resumed farming. He married in 1946, raised 4 children, and lived a life that was unremarkable by the standards of rural America in the mid-20th century. He rarely spoke about his war service, which was typical of his generation. When he did discuss the war, usually with other veterans at the local VFW post, he focused on the general experience rather than specific incidents. The engagement on July 23, 1943, never came up in conversation, not because Jenkins was modest, but because it didn't seem particularly noteworthy to him. He had solved a problem using skills he'd learned as a boy. The solution had worked, and then he'd moved on to the next problem. That it had saved dozens of American lives and influenced Pacific theater tactics wasn't something he emphasized or probably fully understood. Jenkins died in 1983 at age 61, from heart disease unrelated to his war service. His obituary in the Newton County Times mentioned that he was a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific, but provided no details. None of his children knew the specifics of what their father had done on New Georgia. The knowledge died with him, preserved only in military records that were filed in archives and read primarily by historians researching broader campaign narratives rather than individual contributions. The historical irony of Jenkins's story is that it represents both the democratizing power of American military mobilization and the institutional limitations that prevented full utilization of that mobilization's potential. The United States won World War II in part because it could draw on an extraordinarily diverse population with varied skills and knowledge. Farm boys, factory workers, commercial fishermen, construction workers, miners, trappers, and countless other civilians brought practical expertise that proved militarily valuable. But the military's institutional structure, designed for standardization and mass production of combat power, often failed to identify or systematically exploit these specialized skills until the battlefield crisis forced innovation. Jenkins's channeling defenses worked because they emerged from a specific type of knowledge, understanding of animal behavior and terrain features that was common among rural Americans of his generation, but alien to the urban and suburban Americans who dominated military leadership. His tactical innovation succeeded not because it was technically sophisticated, but because it was based on accurate observation of how humans behave under stress in limited visibility. The simplicity of the concept create false trails, mark stop points, position defenders to cover predictable locations, made it easily replicated by other units once they understood the underlying logic. The broader lesson isn't that the army should have created a farm boy specialist classification or established trap setting as a formal military skill. The lesson is that effective military organizations need mechanisms to identify and deploy tacit knowledge expertise that exists in their personnel but isn't captured by formal classification systems. Jenkins's knowledge was valuable specifically on New Georgia in July 1943 because it addressed a specific problem that conventional training and doctrine couldn't solve. Different problems in different contexts would require different types of tacit knowledge. The challenge for military institutions is creating organizational cultures and processes that allow bottom-up innovation to emerge and be recognized quickly enough to have operational impact. Colonel Stebbins's decision to listen to a private first class proposing an unconventional defensive tactic was the critical moment that allowed Jenkins's knowledge to become tactically relevant. Had Stebbins dismissed the idea as backwoods crazy and insisted on conventional defensive doctrine, dozens of American soldiers would likely have died in subsequent engagements, and a potentially valuable tactical innovation would have remained undiscovered. This pattern individual innovation, enabled by leaders willing to experiment with unconventional ideas, appears repeatedly in military history. The development of close air support tactics in World War II emerged from experimental collaboration between Army Air Forces pilots and ground commanders willing to try new approaches. The evolution of carrier aviation tactics came from naval officers who disregarded conventional wisdom about battleship supremacy. The creation of special operations forces grew from recognition that conventional military units couldn't effectively execute certain mission types. In each case, institutional resistance had to be overcome before innovation could spread. Conventional doctrine, formal training, and established organizational structures all created inertia that favored existing approaches over new ideas. The fact that some innovations succeeded despite this resistance speaks to the individuals who championed them, but it also highlights how many potential innovations probably failed to emerge because they lacked similar championship or appeared at moments when institutional resistance was stronger. The final measure of Jenkins's contribution to the Pacific War isn't found in statistics or tactical analyses, but in the lives that continued beyond July 1943 because of his improvised defenses. The soldiers of Company G who survived the night of July 22nd and 23rd went on to fight in subsequent campaigns, returned home after the war, started families, built careers, and lived lives that would have been cut short if conventional defensive tactics had allowed Japanese infiltrators to overrun their position. Their children and grandchildren exist because a farm boy from Arkansas understood how to channel human movement through terrain in ways that military training manuals never taught. This invisible legacy lived because death was prevented represents warfare's most profound human dimension. Military history typically focuses on decisive battles, brilliant strategies, and dramatic turning points. But the vast majority of World War II's outcome was determined by accumulated small advantages in countless minor engagements where tactical superiority saved lives and preserved combat power. Jenkins's channeling defenses were one small advantage among thousands that collectively determined whether American forces could sustain operations, maintain morale, and eventually achieve strategic objectives. The story of how one farm boy's knowledge of rabbit snares translated into a tactical system that killed 60 Japanese soldiers in 2 hours and influenced defensive doctrine across the Pacific Theater is ultimately a story about the relationship between individual expertise and institutional power. Military organizations exist to mass power, to concentrate resources, coordinate action, and overwhelm opponents through superior organization and scale. But the sources of tactical innovation that make military power effective often come from individuals whose knowledge and skills don't fit institutional categories. Howard Jenkins never received public recognition for his contribution to American success in the Pacific War. He wasn't featured in war bond publicity, didn't receive high decorations, and was never consulted by military historians writing official campaign narratives. His innovations spread through the informal networks of soldiers teaching other soldiers, eventually crystallizing into doctrine that bore no trace of their origin. This is how most tactical innovation actually happens in military organizations, not through formal research and development, but through battlefield improvisation that proves effective and gets replicated until it becomes standard. Practice. The fact that Jenkins himself seemed unconcerned with recognition or credit is perhaps the most revealing aspect of his story. He had identified a problem, applied knowledge from his civilian life to develop a solution, and moved on when the solution worked. The military institution that employed him eventually incorporated his ideas without acknowledging their source, which would have bothered someone concerned with personal credit but apparently didn't concern Jenkins. He had done his job, survived the war, and returned to a life where setting traps for rabbits was again just a way to supplement farm income rather than a foundation for tactical innovation. The gap between Jenkins's self-perception as an ordinary soldier doing ordinary work and the historical significance of his contribution reveals something essential about military innovation. The innovations that prove most valuable in warfare often emerge from individuals who don't consider themselves innovators, who are simply applying practical knowledge to solve immediate problems. The genius lies not in revolutionary thinking, but in recognizing that knowledge from one context, trapping animals on an Arkansas farm, might apply to a different context, defending against Japanese infiltration in a Solomon Islands jungle. That leap of imagination, from rabbit snares to channeling defenses, represents the type of creative problem-solving that formal military training struggles to teach. It requires seeing beyond surface differences to recognize underlying patterns that Japanese soldiers moving through jungle darkness behave in some ways like animals moving through unfamiliar territory, that both follow paths of least resistance, that both can be channeled through terrain features, that both make predictable choices when faced with limited options. Military training can teach tactics and procedures, but it cannot easily teach the pattern recognition that allows application of knowledge across radically different contexts. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.